Hello everyone. So this video forms the second part of my introduction to Owen Shears, focusing on the poem Skirrid Fawr. Now, first of all then, a note on the title. Now, Skirrid Fawr is simply the name of Skirrid Hill in Welsh. That is what the Welsh speakers call it, Fawr meaning hill. So in that sense, it's the poem which is the most explicitly linked to the title of the collection. Now, a brief word about the structure of this collection. In a strange kind of way, it's almost backwards, because the first poem in the collection is called Last Act, and yet this, the final poem, is the one which takes its title from the title of the collection, or perhaps vice versa. In a sense, then, there's a way in which this collection is very much dominated by the idea of Shears, in a sense, coming back home to that heritage, because this is where he returns to. Let's then begin, first of all, by reading it, and then I'll discuss some points that arise from it, and we'll take it from there. So, Skirrid Fawr. Just like the farmers who once came to scoop handfuls of soil from her holy scar, so I am still drawn to her back for the answers to every question I have never known, to the sentence of her slopes, the blunt wind glancing from her withers, to the split view she reveals with every step along her broken spine. This edge of her cleft palate, part hill, part field, rising from a low mist, a lonely hulk adrift through Wales. Her east-west flanks, one dark, one sunlit, her vernacular of borders, her weight, the unspoken words of an unlearned tongue. Now, let's then begin. First of all, then, if we look at the second stanza, when Shears uses the first person, it's clear, therefore, that this is a poem being told in that way, and although it's not completely explicit, it's fairly plain that the speaker is intended to be himself. So in that regard, it's an intensely personal poem. But actually, if you look, that is the only use of the first person in the entire poem. So while Shears orients himself as the speaker, the focus of this poem is not about him. The focus of the poem, clearly, is on the hill itself, and principally this idea of journeying to it or towards it. So, let's look now at the beginning. The first line, just like the farmers who once came to scoop handfuls of soil from her holy scar. Now that alludes back to the local tradition which I mentioned in my previous video, the idea that the soil was considered to be sacred. And we have straight away through this simile, this equation then of Owen Shears' relationship with this hill as being almost as a kind of a pilgrimage. There is something sacred or elevated about it. Now, in terms of the reference to scoop, soil, scar, there's a relatively frequent use of sibilance there, which I suppose we can argue, because this is quite an oral poem in that sense, we can argue perhaps sort of serves to connect us, as it were, to this mountain. We can almost hear, it's almost onomatopoeic, the sense that we can hear people running their hands through this soil just as they would have done many years ago. On the second line, you'll also note the reference to her holy scar, that third person pronoun there, which is repeated numerous times. In the next stanza, her back. On the third stanza, her slopes. The fourth stanza, that she reveals her broken spine. So The hill here then is very heavily personified, and for Owen Shears, therefore, it's not simply a hill, but it feels like a living part of the landscape, a living part of his heritage. And yet, for all that it is personified in quite a mysterious way. For example, on the fourth line, the answers to every question I have never known. And similarly, the reference to the cleft palate. A cleft palate is a birth defect that can cause difficulty speaking and communicating. So that metaphor relates to this as well. And finally, in the last stanza, the reference to unspoken words again. He feels this sense of communion, but it's not something that provides answers. Comforts, perhaps, but not answers. And yet still he is drawn, still he feels that link. So, he says then, drawn back to her for the answer to every question I have never known. Note the rather fluid use of enjambment that stretches through these first two couplet stanzas. Of course they are couplets because they are only 2 lines long. To the sentence of her slopes, the blunt wind glancing from her withers. The sentence of her slopes, again it's a metaphor, also further use of sibilance. Again it's this sense that he feels communication coming from it, and yet that it's unclear. The blunt wind glancing from her withers. You might want to talk about the heavy use of that plosive there, blunt wind, which, for anybody who know it, the allusion, to me, it very much reminds me of Ted Hughes' poem Wind, when he talks about a brunt wind, very similar image, but this idea of the sort of violent force of nature. And yet that blunt wind, which is shown to be so aggressive, the verb glancing implies that this wind can barely touch it. We get then this sense of the hill's solidity, its permanence. It only glances off. The reference to her withers, the withers being part of the anatomy of a horse, I think the flanks of a horse or something of that nature. So it's an interesting one then, because we talk about it being personified, and yet in a sense what we're looking at suddenly starts to appear for a moment almost like zoomorphism. The sense that he sees it almost as not just necessarily a mystical person, but perhaps almost a mystical animal. But it goes on. The blunt wind glancing from her withers to the split view she reveals with every step along her broken spine. The split view referencing to several things. First of all, the idea of skirrid, divorce or separation, the emphasis therefore on splits or separation here. And this line is ambiguous. It can mean a number of things. First of all, simply thinking about the twin peaks of the hill that we mentioned earlier. Perhaps also the idea of the views towards England on the one hand, Wales on the other hand. Once again, not completely clear, and like the rest of this poem, it's quite ambiguous and quite mysterious. But this hill, with every step along her broken spine. Now, if this hill represents this link with the past that we're talking about here, then this image, be it personified or zoomorphism according to your judgment, seems to imply that in some sense it is stricken. Is therefore Shears questioning our link with the past? Is he perhaps suggesting that this is something that is fragile? And if we think about Shears as a kind of post-industrial poet, this idea that he's looking at a damaged landscape, a landscape that is shaped and scarred by human activity, perhaps there's a reference to that here. It is shown to be, in this sense, damaged, and yet he is still drawn back, which demonstrates that though damaged, it is not destroyed. There is still hope in it. The imagery of damage, though, continues, because from broken spine on the very next line we have then the metaphor of the cleft palate that I mentioned earlier. Part hill, part field, rising from a low mist. Now, mist as an image, we're into kind of pathetic fallacy terms here, but it's often used again to link with this idea of mystery and ambiguity that I've already alluded to. There are a number of things that connect that, and you could link that to all the things about unspoken words and questions never known that we talked about earlier. A sense of mystery that comes from this. And another metaphor then, a lonely hulk adrift through Wales. Now, hulks usually refer to old ships, traditionally old sailing ships, that at the end of their useful lives would have the masts removed and would be used as floating extra buildings. Anyone who's ever read, for example, Great Expectations will know at the beginning there that the convict Magwitch escapes from a prison hulk, an old ship that's being used as a temporary prison ship. And with the reference to it being described with the adjective adrift, there certainly seems to be that implication here. So again, what perhaps is he saying? The past that seems so solid is in some sense adrift. The past is in some sense uncertain. That is perhaps the case. Or is it perhaps that the future is uncertain? If the hill represents the certainty of the past, perhaps then it's the future that is uncertain. He goes on then, her east-west flanks, again, like the split view, the emphasis on the divided nature of it. Her east-west flanks, one dark, one sunlit. Her vernacular of borders. Now, if here we read this line carefully, the east flank dark, the west flank sunlit. If the west flank is sunlit, then he's talking about the evening, or at least later in the day. Is then this a poem that has a sense of coming to an end? Is this that he's perhaps talking about the end of traditions, the ending of links with the landscape? That is possible. The end of civilizations, even, we're sort of starting to stretch that metaphorical link further, but it is possible. One sunlit, her vernacular of borders. Now, a vernacular refers to the language which is spoken by the ordinary people in a country. So for Owen Shears, he might be alluding to the idea of Welsh as being the vernacular language of Wales. For those of you who've done history, you might also come across that. It's often used in discussions about the Tudors and the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, into the English language from Latin, for example. Yes, her vernacular of borders, again, therefore, though. Vernacular, in that sense, first of all, again, links to the idea of this being some kind of ancient and native language. But also, it can be used to mean something belonging to somewhere. So a sense that this is a hill which belongs to its place. Finally, then, her weight, which again, I suppose, links to the sort of solidity of it that's described variously throughout. Her weight, the unspoken words of an unlearned tongue. Now, clearly on a more literal level, we might see that unlearned tongue as being Welsh itself. And yet I think if we view it more widely and more metaphorically in terms of in terms of a past that we cannot know and can barely communicate with, perhaps that also is what he means here. Let's start to sum up then. So first of all then, this is what we would call a lyric poem. Remember, lyric is not plural, ends on the C. Lyric because it's not narrative, it's not telling a story, it is simply a kind of meditation on this place and an investment in it of these kind of greater mystical significances. It is written in these couplets, and I suppose perhaps like the hill itself, seemingly regular, and yet when we start to look more carefully at the meter, we realise that actually the meter fluctuates very much indeed. This is not a regular 10-syllable iambic pentameter, although there are some lines that are that are 10 syllables long. If we were really going to stretch a point, you might argue that this is a very fluid iambic pentameter, but frankly I think we're probably safer in saying that it is almost verging to free verse here. In that regard, then, it reflects the sort of organic nature of this hill and the sort of unrestrained nature of the landscape, perhaps we can say that. You can link that also to the general quite fluid use of enjambment. There's relatively little end stopping, although it's interesting that the final 3 stanzas do all end stop, and so there's a sense perhaps that the pace almost slows down. Structure-wise, there isn't an enormous amount to talk about, other than, as we've said, the way in which the focus is placed in this kind of third-person voice on the hill itself. The way that the speaker, though present, is largely absent from it, because of the way that this focuses on and reflects on the hill itself. So that, I think, largely concludes the observations on this poem here, which I think is quite an attractive one. It's quite an attractive focus on the on this, and I think it reflects Shear's preoccupation with this landscape quite well. Having said that, I do also think that this is actually one of the harder poems in the collection. I think many of the others are much simpler to get a handle on, but I think the sheer ambiguity of it, I think, is perhaps deliberate and specifically relates to what we were saying earlier about the sense that actually what he's depicting here are things that cannot be known. This is something that is fundamentally a mysterious landscape, and the past that in itself is mysterious. So, I hope that you found that useful. Thank you very much indeed, and on that note we will end this video.